Hey guys, in this episode we're going to use Http4k's support for OpenAPI to build an incredibly useful Swagger UI for our Cats API. The applications of Swagger are endless. Use it for testing, general usage, documentation for end users, other teams, or front-end apps. You can even generate client code. The beauty of having Http4k generate it for you is that you're using the same route definitions and lenses that your server is using. There's very little that can get out of date. Now let's get started. So to get started here, we're first going to go to the core ecosystem, and there's an API, OpenAPI section over here. So we're going to need the OpenAPI module and a JSON library. So if we go to our build.gradle over here, we can see that we already have Moshi. So we just need to add the API module over here. Now we can go over to our API, and instead of returning routes, we are going to return a contract. And we are going to need to transfer our routes from this routes function to the contract. So we're going to add our list cats method over here. So v1 cats, and this is where we can start to add some information about our route that's going to appear in the spec. We can give it an operation ID. That's just the ID that you'll see. But most importantly is the summary. This is going to be front and center the name of the operation. So list cats in a friendly string. We can also give some information about what it's returning. In this case, it's always going to return OK. It's returning the cat's lens, and we can give it a sample. So we need an array of some sort of sample over here. Let's get the cat sample, where we get our random ID. We say that it was created by user 1. It was created at this time. Date of birth, we're going to do Kratos, 2022, September 4th. So his breed is an American Shorthair, which I'm sure everyone already knows by now. And his color is a lynx point tabby. Okay, so we have the sample. We can put it in our example over here. So cat sample. And now we actually need to implement it. So we need to define a regular HTTP handler, a function that takes a request and returns a response. And we can just go and copy this and it compiles. Okay, next. Now we have getting a cat, and this one looks a little different. We're going to need to import the div function over here, and then we can use the div operator as shorthand, and we're going to embed the ID lens. So before, all this did was turning the ID lens into a string that had the lens name, but this is actually using the lens to route our request. Much more type safe. So this is v1 get cat. The name is getCat, and it's going to return OK with a cat singular lens to a singular cat sample, but it's also possibly going to return not found, and we can give it a description, cat not found. Very useful. This one is going to be implemented a little differently because now we can actually get the ID in the signature over here, and then we pass in our typical request handler. So we're going to copy everything below where we get the ID. And why doesn't this compile? Oh, there we go. So we get the ID as part of the signature, and we no longer have to use the lens directly to get it. Cool. So now we're going to get into our authenticated operations. But instead of using this lens here, we actually need to define a security. which we'll call JWT security. And this is a bearer auth security. And if we look at it, we want the same sort of signature that's going to use the lens and take our token and return the principal. So over here, we're going to want this one here. So we take a user ID lens and we use the verify function. And we can also give it a name if we want. Google auth, I guess. So now when we transfer our route over here, we use v1 cats, and in our meta, we give it the same operation ID and summary as before. v1 create cat summary is create cat, and then we pass in the security. Now this one is going to return a bunch of possible status codes. So there's regular, where it returns a cat lens. There's unauthorized, where bearer token required. However, a new difference is that we are taking a receiving. So this is the cat data lens, where we need a sample. And we just need to take this, copy, and oh, not created at. That compiles. Okay, so we take the cat data sample. Okay, so bind contract to a post. Now this one is going to look like the first one, where there is no ID being passed in. It's just the HTTP handler. And we can take all of this, and oh, we do actually need a name for the request, because we're getting the principal and we're getting the cat data from the request. That one's done. Now we also want delete. So this one is called v1 delete cat. The summary is delete cat. This one isn't receiving anything, but it is returning a cat. But it's also returning unauthorized if there's no bearer token. But it's also returning forbidden if the user doesn't have permission. So don't have permission to delete this cat. Okay, is that everything? We also need the security. And we bind it to delete. We take the ID, we take the request. We can copy this over, and we need to define our function for early returns, and we can replace these ID lens usages with the ID that we get in through the contract. Okay, that is compiling. So let's test this for backwards compatibility. And it still passes, works exactly the same. However, now that we have this contract defined, we can actually start to do stuff with it. So in our cats API, we can define a renderer, and we want the OpenAPI 3 renderer, which takes some info. The title is going to be cats API, and the version is going to be v1. And in the example over here, the renderer looks like that and takes Jackson. Well, we don't have Jackson. We have Moshi. So let's put that in instead. And in our cats test, we are going to need to add a test over here to see if we can generate the spec, which we're actually going to override the description path from root to OpenAPI.json, which is my preferred place to put it. This one is going to be generate OpenAPI spec, and it's going to be an approval test. So we do a get to OpenAPI.json, we pass it through the API, and then we run our approval test. Okay, so we run that, and it's going to fail the first time. So, no JSON adapter for iterable. Yes. This is actually because we tried to use Moshi to generate this. Unfortunately, the default OpenAPI 3 renderer requires Jackson. However, there is a fallback one we can use. This one is more limited, but we'll do that first to show you what you can get with it, and then later we will upgrade to the Jackson one. All right, so we got all of this stuff, which I'm sure is great. It's hard to tell when I can't really, well, when all I have is JSON, so we're just going to prove it for now. Run it again. And it failed again because the IDs in our CAD example have changed. Right. That's because in our sample over here, we used a random UUID. So let's go and generate one. And copy that. And instead of random, we use from string this. Okay, run again. And approve it. And run again. And it passes. Okay, great. So I still don't know what any of that looks like. So let's go and add a UI over here. We have our API, we have our web app. We are going to have a Swagger UI. And Http4k API, OpenAPI, comes with Swagger UI and Redoc. The difference being Swagger is more interactive and Redoc is typically better, if not interactive. I really like the interactiveness, so we're going to be using Swagger. And these ones are light because they are actually delegating all the resources to a CDN. If you specifically import the Swagger UI and Redoc WebJar dependencies from Http4k, you can use the WebJars hosted on your server. We need a URL to our description, which is OpenAPI.json. Is that it? I don't really remember. Oh, page title, which is going to be the name of our browser window. Cats API, and we'll just call it Swagger UI to be different. And we need to embed it into our routes over here. So unfortunately, there is a bit of a conflict here where both the web app and the Swagger UI are trying to be the root page. Right now, there is a bit of an issue with Swagger UI Lite where if it's not root, it just doesn't work. So we're going to demote the web app to the UI route. And let's run that for real. So normally our web page has the sign in with Google. We refresh and we get our Swagger UI. Pretty cool. So this one is the limited version. Some of the issues are our schemas don't have proper names, and it doesn't tell you whether these properties are nullable or not. Now, we don't know what an object number thingamabobber is, but if we go over to listcats, we see that it has an example response of this. This is the one that we used in our contract. And it also shows us the schema. So it's objects ending in 18 and it has all of that stuff. Those are pretty much the only downsides to this limited non-reflective version. you'll still maybe want to use it regardless. So if you, for some reason, you don't want to use Jackson at all, this is good. Or if you're working in a resource-constrained environment where you want fast cold starts, like in serverless applications on AWS Lambda, or if you're using ProGuard or GraalVM, getting rid of reflection is going to make things much easier. But now we can actually test our app without curl anymore, which is huge. I wish we had done this earlier. So we hit try it out over here. We execute the request, and here is the cat inside of our database already. We can also create a cat. It gives us an example. 401 unauthorized. Okay, well, there is the security in action there. We're going to need a new token. So let's do that. Let's go to UI, sign in with Google, and we get an error because localhost 8000 redirect is no longer existing. We need to reconfigure our app to use UI redirect. So there's two things we need to do there. In our run configuration, we need to update the redirect URI to UI redirect. And we need to go to our Google client over here and change the authorized redirect URI to UI redirect. Okay, let's try that again. Let's go back to UI, sign in. Actually, what I think I forgot to do here was restart the app. So let's try that again. There we go, we have our token. So let's go back over to the Swagger UI, which is now the roots, and we can click this authorize button where we can paste our token. Now when we try to create a cat, it will be accepted. So let's go over to list cats, and we have both of them. And say I don't want Athena anymore, which would be terrible, but say we didn't want to. I can go and paste her into delete, and she was deleted. The remaining one is Kratos, and we can go and test getCat, where it returns him, and if we mess up the ID, we get a not found. That's pretty cool. So let's see what we get if we upgrade to Jackson. Let's go to our build Gradle, and we're going to add the Jackson mapper. We can continue to use Moshi for our lenses. We just need to get Jackson in addition to Moshi. And in our cats API, where we just create the renderer, we can get rid of this and use Jackson. So now we're just like the example over here, where we have the API info and Jackson. Let's run that. Things are looking a little nicer here. Our schemas actually have names, and we get a bit more metadata about them of whether they're nullable. So we get these nice little red asterisks. That's pretty much what it gives you. However, let's see if our test still passes. It does not, because there is a whole bunch of extra metadata here that we didn't have before. So let's approve that. Run again. And good. There is one more thing to show you. In this example here, we are specifically using Jackson. However, there is a thing called OpenAPI Jackson. What is the difference? Well, if we run our cats test again, we see that it fails, and the difference is that null properties are no longer serialized. In this API over here, it doesn't actually make a difference, it still works. But if you ever have any nullable properties in your DTOs, like the cat or cat data, then regular Jackson will cause problems. So I recommend use OpenAPI Jackson, or even just get rid of the override altogether. So let's run that again. And we can see that once again, the null properties are no longer being serialized. So let's approve that. And let's just see if it looks any different when we run our UI over here. And no, not really. And that's pretty much it. That is how you get a nice Swagger UI, which makes it so much easier to do manual testing for your app. I wish we had this before. I don't like using curl. This is so much better. So that was how to generate a Swagger UI for your Http4k API. Next time, we'll use the same Http4k contracts used to generate the spec to help us integrate an external API. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything else you'd like to see before we get to deployment. And that's it. See you later.